from just outside the Empire City at the crossroads to the northeast. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you are and whenever you are, this is your premier podcast for all things unknown, not media, and I'm your host, JP. Welcome to Not Media. I'm your host, JP. Again, by popular demand, I have my good friend Jesse back. We did a podcast. I forget what episode it was. I think it was like episode 9, where he had come on approximately a year ago, and we discussed David McGowan's book, Program to Kill, and it seemed like that was a big hit, more so on YouTube. It seems like that's where that seemed to get a good amount of hits and amount of people commenting, and I think that, I think we had mentioned in that podcast about how this draws people in, and we're not going to go back into it, but why there's been such a resurgence in this fascination with killers and serial killers, and why so many people get into that. Maybe because it touches upon a dark side that exists in all of us, and people have a fascination with that because society doesn't allow us to explore that normally. Again, just a quick introduction. Jesse is a teacher. He has taught a class he was getting into last time about serial killers, and normally he's a English teacher. And if he wants to tell you any more, he can. Like I said, you can go back over episode 9 and listen to that. We got into a little bit of our backgrounds, but this time around, he put me on to, I think it was it's John DeCamp and Nick Bryant. These are two authors that are more widely known, I guess, in relation to what we want to talk about today, which is what has become known as the Franklin scandal. And there's not one source that we're going to cite more so than another on this. We're just going to kind of go over multiple points of reference as far as what we have and what the Franklin scandal is. And before Jesse had put me onto it, I didn't really know much about it. But, the more I looked into it, the more I was disturbed by finding what I found, and or at least hearing some of the facts about what was going on. And it checks off all the boxes of disturbing. We go from child prostitution to murder to drug sales to definitely political corruption. But, as far as how wide and how far that political corruption goes still remains unknown. But so let's just start getting into it. Just real quick, if we had to, without getting into, because we discussed last time the book Program to Kill, it went into a whole lot, and it almost seemed like it was like too much, because then the average reader might have been left standing at the side of the road, like with their hands in the air, like what exactly are we getting at here? So maybe we can kind of tackle that first, and then just kind of start getting into that. So if I'll start off, and then I'll ask Jesse if you want to comment. So just to start off, if we could just quickly sum up what the Franklin scandal was, like what exactly was it? And I think we could say, I'm just going to kind of give my quick little summary, and then you can add what you want to add, and then we'll start getting into some of the key players. So I believe it was 1988. There was a credit union in Omaha, Nebraska, named the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union, and the general manager was a gentleman, a rising star in the Republican Party, named Lawrence E. King, and they were doing some sort of a audit. I don't know if it was like a national audit on the books of the credit union, and something wasn't jiving, as far as where the money was going, how it was being accounted for. You have a credit union in this country, you have to have records of all your finances coming in, all your finances going out. I think we all have kind of heard of these things in this country where people have like Swiss bank accounts and like offshore bank accounts. I think this is like a common thing. I'm sure that's been glorified in the movies, but there's some truth to it that people can take money and kind of make it disappear out of this country. And when there's no more records of where your money goes as to what that money's doing, starts to become very dangerous because it could be used for nefarious acts. And I think the intelligence world has been bogged down in that in history where, money does disappear and money does go into the black budget, so to speak. I know in the UFO world, we know all about this. And, that's a problem. So anyhow, at the end of the day, roughly 40 million or 39 or 40 million dollars was not accounted for. And, when they started going into this probe about what exactly is going on here and where did this money go, it started to uncover this network of not only scandal with the money, but a network of the players that were involved in this credit union and maybe some of the nefarious acts they were doing with this money, and why they were doing this. And it involves children, it involves pedophilia, it involves prostitution and drug sales. So I don't know, Jesse, if you want to comment on that.
Well, that seems like you cover the opening of this story that begins to be a can of worms, that suddenly it's not just about this money that was stolen. Essentially, he creates a Ponzi scheme of some sorts, offering these CDs at high interest rates. So people are like, wow, if I invest in a CD at the Franklin Credit Union, now I can get 20% return on my money. Too good to be true, which it was. And so you had many people investing into the credit union. Now, another reason the credit union was, highly sought after, you have to understand a little bit about the background. The credit union was supposed to be offering loans and opportunities, financial opportunities for people in the Franklin area. So Franklin is in Nebraska, and it's a small city that has a large minority population, particularly African American at the time, and a low income background. So here you have this guy, Larry King, who's saying, I'll take over the credit union, which was kind of at that time starting to peter out. It was not getting enough investment. It was starting to not really be able to sustain itself. He comes along and says, I'm going to rejuvenate it. I'll take it over. And within a few years, it's a thriving credit union, getting investments from high-end people all over Nebraska and around the country suddenly within a few years. So he turns it around overnight and becomes kind of a local star. And suddenly this star of his becomes even larger because he's starting to make a name for himself, not only as in the local Nebraska, Franklin area because of him turning around this credit union, but he starts to become a star in the political sphere. And he's starting to rub shoulders with some of the elites in the Republican Party as high up as the Bush family. And there's pictures that you can see with him with George Bush Jr.'s daughter and with the George Bush himself, Jr. So he was really starting to go up the ladder at a time where there was a high need in the Republican Party to show that it had a more diverse background of members. So to have this up and coming African American successful businessman to be a voice for the Republican Party at that time was even a bigger plus. And in fact, he even sang at the Republican National Convention. And you could find that video out there. He had a very, strong kind of operatic voice that he was known for. So they asked him to sing like the national anthem and stuff. So suddenly he's this big key player. This kind of no one from this guy from this humble background suddenly becomes someone on the big political stage in America as a result of him turning around this credit union, which ultimately turns out to be a complete corrupt situation.
Okay, wow. Yeah, that definitely looks into who Lawrence King was. I'm not sure exactly what I tried to look into this. I don't know exactly what the paper trail of him is right now. I know he was working at a car dealership. At some point, I think in the early 2000s, down in Virginia, I think Fredericksburg, Virginia, somebody had cited, and then so I don't know if he's still alive or where Lawrence King is right now, but we can kind of start getting into like what exactly happened with him and maybe some of the other players about why he was considered a suspicious person or somebody who was up to nefarious acts. So just a little bit of background on him, more so. Like you see, I already had one and two. He was a leader in the Black Republican Party. I even read somewhere somebody had stated, like, I think it was George Bush's daughter was at one of the parties. Somebody quoted wearing Larry King around like a blanket. Like that's how closely she was tied to him, walking around the party. It looked like she was thrilled to be next to him. This guy's got this charisma. He's the guy that sings. He's the guy that's the up and coming star of the party. So it seems like he got a lot of social. He was very respected, starting to get a lot of high respect in the social world of, high politics going on here in this country, and especially within the Omaha, Nebraska area. Just a little bit more background. He did serve in the military in Singapore. And then, once he got, and I think he also, in the early 1970s, I think he was involved with getting Girls Club in Omaha started. I think it was 73. He became the president. So for somebody that was later on accused of, and I kind of had noted this when I was doing my research, a lot of times you find these antisocial. I guess I was going on with somebody who's in the world of serial killers, and I guess they're shying away from sociopath and psychopath. They're kind of I guess the popular now term is like antisocial personalities, because there's just such a large spectrum of like what is a psychopath, what is a sociopath, and everything, all the shades of gray. So this these people, and you would think just by the nature of the things they get involved with, the things that they're accused of, having sex with children, abusing children, and selling drugs, and this and that, that they would be not able to get themselves into society, infiltrated in a way where they're held in a high light. And it's actually oftentimes just the opposite, and I'll cite the case of John Gacy, who was very much always he was trying to make himself like what Larry King was, like this rising star. John Gacy was always trying to do that. He had a checkered past as far as, I think he abused some kid at a restaurant when he was younger, the manager of a fast food restaurant, and he had moved to another town, tried to shake that record. But everywhere he moved, he was always getting involved in like what we would say like the local social clubs, like the Elks Club or this or that. There was a club out there, and I think wherever Gacy was, I think it was like Illinois, he was in the JCs. And the JCs came up in this book also as a local social club, because I think that's a national thing where it's like men of the community get together and they try to do good things for the community. Like, hey, if it's like how to show young men how to build houses, how to teach them carpentry, or like how to do positive things with our community. It's like these groups were, put in place to do things like that. And, so it's just like, that's just a note where these kind of really bad actors are chameleons, and they work their way into these high social clubs, and they always want to be somebody of need, somebody that's held in a high light. And with Gacy, like I said, making himself a clown for kids' birthday parties, making himself the president of the JCs, and on his weekends, he's out there strangling and raping young boys, So it's like this guy, Larry King, was involved in an orphanage, basically, these boys' club and girls' club. These were Boys Town. These are I think there was a documentary in the 70s on Boys Town, and it was a place that was considered like a place where young men who came from broken families and such, they can go and they can get their life straightened out. And, it was held in a high light in the country, these organizations. So you have Larry King involved with Girls Club, which was kind of like a sister, I'm going to say like an orphanage to Boys Town, and he was the president in the early 1970s, and then he gets himself involved in this Franklin Credit Union, and then it takes about a decade for these allegations, a little bit more, to start coming out about what exactly he's doing. And if we want to get into the first cases of what exactly or how exactly did we get an inkling that this guy was up to no good. And then in 1988, after the Franklin Committee was put together, and that was a investigative committee. And a lot of people look at it like now, like almost like the Warren Commission, where it was kind of like a sham job, where it didn't really, at least as far as it went to the grand jury, didn't really get its fair shot at the truth about what was going on with the Franklin Credit Union. So in 1985, there was a foster home, and it was being run by a couple called the Webbs, and some of their kids came forward, I guess, with their school, saying they were being abused, they were being smacked around, they were being beaten and sexually abused by the heads of this foster home. And these Webbs, they were high in the area of the Omaha. They were high in the institutions of the area of Omaha, and they were actually friends with Larry King. So it was early back as 1985, we started seeing that these admissions of these kids going to foster homes and then getting sexually abused. And then later on, we started seeing these Webb children speaking about Nellie Webb, I think her name was Nellie Patterson, started talking about how she was taken to parties, how a man named Larry King used to force her to go to parties. They would put them on planes and fly them around the country to these high-end political parties where she saw the Bushes at some point, and they were forced to have sex with men. And Larry King would use these situations to kind of either coerce people in political situations, to use it as like bribery. And so I don't know if you want to add anything to that,
Yeah.
Jess.
So yeah, that's going back into the weeds of it a little bit. If you go back to the Webbs, so it's important to know that Barbara Webb, she is a cousin of Larry King. So there's already a
Okay.
connection here with the Webb family to Larry King. So Barbara's Larry's cousin, and then her husband, Jarrett Webb, who was also employed by the Omaha Public Power District, which was a utility company that was on the Franklin Credit Union board. So right here with the Webbs, we're getting connections directly to Larry King. So Ulysses Washington was one of the children that they adopted. They adopted something like, I want to say, 8 children altogether. They were adopting children. Once again, they were winning all these awards in the neighborhood for being these great parents. Suddenly, like you had mentioned, there's one of their children goes over to the neighbors and says that they're being beaten and abused by the Webbs. And this opens up an investigation by Child Services. This kind of starts the ball rolling of what's going on at the Webb home. And as Child Services starts looking into it more, they're finding out that these kids are being abused. And Ulysses Washington, who was adopted by the Webbs, reveals in an interview that when she's having an interview with Child Services, that there was this Uncle Larry King who they often went to Uncle Larry King's house for these lavish parties. She had at one time seen Uncle Larry King come over and saw him handing a video to his cousin. And she later said that the video she found out when she played it was child pornography. So she's starting to see that this Uncle Larry King is really not a good character. And suddenly he starts kind of luring her into this lifestyle of going to these parties that he throws where there are nothing but young men and women that are kind of being pimped out to people who are attending these parties. And that's where this connection between the Webbs and Larry King starts coming up. And we start to get literal on-fact reports from these children from the Webb family about Larry King's name. Now, you got to think it's 1986. Larry King is the darling of Omaha. He's this guy who turned the Franklin Credit Union around. He's getting all this publicity, but in the background, his name is starting to come up in these reports of child abuse. Not too long after that, you have a girl by the name of Shanita Moore. She is also a troubled child. She had a mother that had her going to a facility in the area called the Uda Alley, I believe it's called. It's a foster care place for young women. Shanita, while she's living at Uda Alley, reveals to one of their counselors that she has been experiencing sexual abuse. And again, she starts telling this counselor by the name of Kirsten Halber that she's been going to these parties that have been run by this guy named Larry King. So again, we're talking, this is about June 15th, 1986. Larry King's name again comes up separate from the webs about another young person stating that they've been attending these parties, and Larry King's part of this kind of pedophilic network that he's pimping these children out to. Reports are made, a little bit of investigation is looked into it, but nothing that comes to the forefront of the local media or anything like that. Larry King is still a respected member of the community, although oddly enough, we have multiple reports of his name coming up on children saying that he's part of this pedophilic network. So he's living that life. And it's not too long after these reports are made and not much investigation is put into it that suddenly there is a report in 1988. So a few years later, where we have this photographer by the name of Rusty Nelson, who is being investigated by Omaha Police Department officer by the name of Carmine. And he gets called by a parent who says that her child was working for this guy, Rusty Nelson, who claimed that he wanted to use her daughter as a model for different sorts of advertisements that he does photography for. It seemed like an up and up situation. He asks her to come to an apartment that he does his photography shoots out of called the Twin Towers, which is located in Omaha. She comes to his apartment while they're in the apartment, and she's getting ready to start getting these photos. The mother just sees that there's like images on a table somewhere that she says of children who are scantily clad, if not completely naked. Obviously, she's taken back by that and suddenly is questioning Rusty Nelson if he's a legitimate photographer, or is this just some sort of sick, photography ring that he's a part of. So at that point, she takes her daughter, leaves Rusty's apartment, and reports her concerns to Officer Carmine, who starts his own investigation. So now we're in 1988. This is the third instance of where we start to hear Larry King's name come up. Why? Because Rusty Nelson, the apartment that he's in, is being sublet by none other than Larry King. So he's kind of subletting this apartment where these pornographic images are being taken by this guy, Rusty Nelson. And Carmine starts digging deeper into what's going on at this apartment. He starts talking to people at the Twin Towers, and they find out that Larry King not only is subletting that apartment, he also owns the penthouse at the Twin Towers. So he owns multiple apartments in the Twin Towers, and as he's investigating more and talking to people at the Twin Towers, he's starting to find out that there's suspicion all along of Larry King coming there with young children. No one really knows what's going on in the apartments, but they are seeing him coming in and out with children at the apartments. And so, again, Larry King's name is coming up. And this is kind of the first time a more concrete investigation into Larry King is taking place. That brings us just to about November 1988, as Officer Carmine is looking into this, where suddenly the Federal Credit Union comes into national news that it's been this big Ponzi scheme and corruption going on. But at this point, nobody has known about all these previous reports of Larry King being involved.
Yeah.
So,
and especially with you have to kind of just look as far as a timeline of technology about what was going on in 1988 as opposed to what's going on now. Now we have everybody's got a cell phone that has 5G internet. Everybody's very connected. The national crime databases that are being shared by law enforcement agencies are much better, well connected now than they were in 1988. It was a lot harder to be able to just, look somebody's name up. I know, if like I'll do a car stop and there'll be like somebody that we run in something called e-justice, which is what we use in New York anytime there's a criminal investigation or any sort of law enforcement investigation. You got to look somebody's name up, and then you start seeing hits like, is this guy wanted? We call for a file 5, which is a warrant, or they wanted out of another agency. Though all this comes up, and maybe some of their criminal history, if you wind up arresting them for something, or if there's a further investigation into them, you might be able to pull a national crime record on somebody and then see like, hey, this guy has already been investigated for this, and this, and I think that was just a lot harder to get at in 1988, with the, not to say that the internet wasn't around, but it was right at its beginning, as far as what was being used for, widely. So you could wind up getting yourself involved in a situation and it could get brushed under the carpet, especially if you have key players in certain towns or cities working for you. And I think just to kind of give a little bit of an angle on what you had gone into with, like you said, I think his name was Officer Car. I don't know
Carmine,
if it's
Carmine.
Carmen or Carmine. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it, but yes, we'll just say Carmine. So Officer Carmine works for the Omaha Police Department. At the time, its chief was a man named Robert Wadman, whose name comes up quite often in relation to the Franklin scandal. When the Franklin Committee started looking into this corruption. So just to give a little glimpse into like what we're seeing here as far as how or what is going on and like why is this corrupt and how could a man who I think on the books I thought I read somewhere was Larry King on the books supposed to be making only like $16,000 a year. It was like a very being the head of this credit union. I think on the books it was like a very meager salary,
Yes.
but he was living this very lavish lifestyle. They even said at one point at the Twin Towers, the penthouse, he got such a nice couch and such a large couch, they couldn't even get it through the door. They literally had to take a wall out. They had to buy a crane. They had to get it was like a $1,400, and we're talking the 1980s. We're talking like, if you put inflation down for that and everything, like how that would probably be like a couch worth, $2,500, $3,000 plus now. So they actually had to take a wall out. So just do the math on that. How much money that would cost to rent a crane, to take a wall out, to install a couch. Like, think about the sort of means that you have to have in order to want to live that sort of lavish lifestyle. Most people would just get a smaller couch. I mean, that's the average person. But this guy was living such a lavish lifestyle where it was almost like, in some aspects, almost like before some of these, before Rome fell. Was it Nero? Some of these really, now that we look out through history, these really lavish Roman rulers that were like that would basically take the bankrupt the entire city that they were in charge of just so they could have a lavish and over excessive lifestyle. And that was why Rome eventually fell. And it was almost like Larry King was like skirting this sort of lifestyle, limos and jets and high credit card bills every month, 100,000 credit card bills, which were always paid off. Very, very flowers and roses and expensive dinners. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars every month. Larry King was when they started looking into the Franklin, like where did this money go? And but back around to not get too far away from just the point I wanted to make really quick. It was known, and it came out during the investigation of the Franklin Committee that Larry King, even though Chief Wadman of the Omaha Police Department denied that he was really close with Larry King made quite a few references to how close he was with Chief Wadman. So because of this lavish lifestyle and this access to large amounts of money and what we're finding out later, large amounts of drugs and girls and whatever you wanted, this guy King could get it for you. He became that sort of character, that sort of bad actor. And just to give it a little glimpse into how corruption factored into what was going on with this investigation at early stage. There was another girl that came forward. Her name was Loretta Isabel Smith. And she stated when she was young, she would hang around. And this is how we start skating over to the lines of like how this corruption maybe skirted the lines of some sort of possible satanic cults also. And it circles back around to the officer that had originally investigated the claims of Larry King, Carmine, and what happened to him. So he looked into at one point another girl. Not only that, he looked into this situation that you had spoken about with Larry King. He was originally set up to investigate these claims that the King was up to with these allegations of misconduct against children and
Mhm.
and the webs, like whatever was going on in that situation. He also looked into another girl, Loretta Isabel Smith, who was staying at a mental health facility, and started talking to the counselors there and the staff that she was hanging around the Omaha Girls Club, mind you, a link to Larry King because he was the president in 1973. And eventually, Boys Town boys would hang out with the Girls Club girls, and these are both orphanages, so kids that are high risk from broken families, and these places are supposed to be giving them a purpose and a possibility for a good life. Eventually, she got, at an age of 9 or 10, stated she started going to parties where older males would have sex with her for money. And some of these got more violent and more dark, and they started having these rituals at some of these parties. And one time she was locked in a room, and she states that, and this is a warning for people if they get upset easily, that they killed a female infant at one of these parties. And they actually had to cut her eyes out in front of her, and they made her sit in a room and stare at this dead female infant that was murdered. And it was terrible. She stated that there were men walking around with code names like King's Horses. And whether Larry King himself was at this party, she just states that something bad happened to her, and they started looking into it. And it turns out that Officer Carmine was one of the officers that actually went out to investigate this situation with Loretta Smith, and it basically got squashed. And they said there was no substance to it. And when they started looking to, well, what happened to Officer Carmine, he started looking into the situation. And this was not just Loretta Smith. There was a handful of these children that were abused that stated that these names were coming up like King's Horses. Larry King hung around this guy. I think his name was like Nary Nook, or they don't really even know his name, but he was a local DJ. And he was a young man. I think they stated his description was young African-American man or young black man, muscular, was a DJ at a possible nightclub. But all of these witnesses said that there was a muscle that hung around Larry King, and they called him King's Horses. So the fact that these names are coming up with these really dark situations, and a lot of these kids weren't even talking to each other, and some of the same names came up. So Officer Carmine goes to investigate this, and like, what the hell is going on here? And the people from this mental hospital, and they say, well, he's been transferred out. And they're like, what do you mean transferred out? He's like, he's no longer on the case. They said there was nobody, there was no substance to these claims, and they just squashed it. And the normal people from these hospitals that were hearing these claims of these children that were getting like horribly abused, and these stories of murder and ritualistic murder and Satanism and these very, very dark claims that were coming out of at least one child at the time, they were like, why isn't this being looked into further? And when they looked further into it, Wadman actually pulled Carmine off the squad and then had his mental competence tested. So he started getting close to some sort of very big evil that was going on in that area. And he was pulled off by the chief of police. And, as we see later on, and we'll kind of just mention the name right now, one of the witnesses, all right, I just want to mention the name when they started looking into the Franklin Committee. They needed an investigator. The committee members of the Franklin Committee were Senator Lawrence Schmidt and Ernie Chambers. One was a Republican and one was a Democrat. So this kind of crossed border lines as far as, we could fight on certain things, but when it comes to abusing children, let's, both sides of the political line came together to try to fix this problem. They needed someone to get there to the bottom of this, because they said, hey, everybody keeps brushing this aside. We go to the police, the chief of police at the Omaha, police department, and he says there's nothing to it. There's no substance to this, but yet the kids are saying that there's substance to this. So people are, like the investigation starts leading around in circles at a very superficial level, because let's say, for example, the people at the hospital where Loretta Smith is at, this girl is coming forward with extremely disturbing claims of how she witnessed murders and was sexually abused. Okay, so let's look into that. All right, so we called the police. Who would you call? You would call the police, right? Yeah. Everybody knows that, all right? So this girl's being abused. The police are going to come, and they're going to save the day. And all of a sudden, the police go away. And they're like, well, whatever happened with that? And they're like, well, they didn't find any substance to it. Like, did they not? I mean, like, how far did they look into it? And like the average person would be like, those are pretty serious claims. Like, and so then when you go to the police and then police say, hey, nothing to see here, you go back around and you say, okay, well, we don't just have one a person. We have a number of kids coming forward. It's just some of the names that were in the mix were Alicia Owen, Paul Bonacci. There was another King. The kid's last name was King, but no relation to Larry King, that came forward. So there was a handful of people that came forward now, and you start spinning in circles when you're the Senator Lawrence Schmidt and Ernie Chambers. And you're saying, "Hey, we want answers," and you're like, "Well, we went to the police, and the police are saying that there's nothing to see here." So then they said, "Okay, so then what we'll do is we'll go above the police," because somebody politely said, "Hey, if you go to a restaurant and you say, hey, I'd like to speak to a manager. That waitress is being rude, and something bad happened. I'd like to talk about it." Okay, we'll go to the manager. Well, the manager isn't being helpful. Well, what would be the next step? Maybe call the general manager. You got to find somebody above the chain of command to start getting stuff done. So they say, well, if the local police aren't helping, who do we go to next? When there's claims of interstate, sexual, their interstate prostitution ring with children and claims of ritualistic murder, these really dark claims that are coming out. Who do we go to? Let's take it a step up then. So these gentlemen were smart enough to say, let's go to the local regional head of the FBI, because this would be interstate if the local police officer isn't giving us the things that we want to know. It turns out that man's name was Nick O'Hara, and Nick O'Hara was very, very good friends with Robert Wadman. So if Wadman was putting the kibosh on any of these claims, now it takes a step up to the FBI, where now the FBI is now saying, hey, whatever Wadman did is good to me, so you don't try to throw any dirt on him. So now when we start involving like law enforcement in this and people very, very high positions of power, like this stuff just starts to go away. So they hire this man afterwards. They say, well, okay, let's take a step back now. We've gone to the chief of police. Negative. We've gone to the FBI. Negative, because now the guy from the FBI is saying that, well, Robert Wadman is my boy, so you're not going after him. So you better have damn good reason to be sitting in my office right now. And they basically were threatened to kick rocks. Like, you better have some damn good evidence when you come forward and you start making claims like this. So they're already facing strong opposition to get anything done when it comes to looking into any of these these claims of that we had spoken about, why the Franklin scandal was becoming such a problem. So they hired a man named Gary Caradori. I believe he was a former patrolman or a state patrolman who became a private investigator. At the time, I think this was around 1989, he became the point man on this investigation of like, okay, so we've gone to the official channels to try to get something done here, and we were told to kick rocks. What do we do now? And I think the very simple answer to that became, show me the money and show me the victims. Because, as far as me being a police officer, I would say that was spot on. Well, if you're not getting any answers from anybody, if you're getting the runaround, you keep getting the runaround. Okay, so why are we making these claims in the first place? We have people coming forward saying they were abused. Get me those people. Sit them down. Let's see if we can get those people in lengthy interviews. And that's what Gary Caradori did. He started tracking down these victims, and he started doing long videotape statements of these victims and what exactly, the names of the people, the places they were, the times. Let's build a storyline for each one of these victims, exactly how they fit into this nebulous network of what easily could be brushed under a carpet as false claims and false accusations, kids with wild imaginations looking to get some notoriety because, some of these victims that came forward, like including Alicia Owen and Paul Bonacci, they were both criminals at the time. Alicia Owen was serving time for writing bad checks. She wrote $700 in bad checks, and Paul Bonacci was babysitting a young boy, and he put his hand outside this boy's pants and started feeling him up, and then stopped when he realized he was doing something wrong, but he still they sentenced him to 5 years for inappropriately touching a young child while babysitting. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that. So this is how we're starting to see corruption? Like, where does the corruption angle come into this, and how did it factor into, like, it sounds so easy on the outside. Well, if you have a victim and they're making a claim, let's just get that victim. Let's get them to testify, but it wasn't so simple when you have people, heavy players and heavy political players involved, and you've gone to the police, you're not getting the answer. You've gone above the police and you're not getting any justice. And then they hire Gary Caradori, and then they circle back around to the roots of, like, how do you build a case? And he gets back straight to the victims. And that's where we start getting into Alicia Jano and Paul Bonacci, Loretta Isabel Smith. We start getting very lengthy videotape statements from these victims, exactly how they were victimized.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, and it's also at the same time hard to believe. To go back a little bit to the committee that was created in Omaha that you referenced, and I thought that was a great point you made, that this was a bipartisan committee that was looking into this investigation. It was being supported on both ends, two respected people. They're trying to put this together. To give a little bit of back information on that, it's interesting to know the person that they first looked to be the head of the board. So Schmidt was looking for someone to head the board's investigation. They actually reached out to former CIA director William Colby, and that's kind of an important little side note for a few reasons. Something to think about, just to add another layer to this. Partly Colby was being considered because there was concerns that this credit union corruption case was going to be something bigger than just Omaha. In fact, one of the rumors was that this might have been a CIA front. They might have been using this credit union as a CIA front to fund the Nicaraguan Contras. And that's a whole other story, but there was belief that the CIA had used different kind of front companies and banks throughout the country to siphon in money because they couldn't get money from Congress to fund their support of the Nicaraguan Contras, who were fighting the communists out of Nicaragua at the time. The CIA was trying to support the revolutionaries. So there was a rumor that might have been part of this whole credit union, that it wasn't just a financial Ponzi scheme, but something that was being done on a CIA level. And so she wanted somebody that could come in and had that upper level experience in the investigative community on the federal level. So they offer William Colby to take it over. He ends up being too expensive for them to hire. His hourly rate was too much. But funny enough, Colby was also head of the CIA's Phoenix program in Vietnam. And who worked under Colby during this time in Vietnam? Colby, it was John DeCamp. John DeCamp was a subordinate of William Colby during the Phoenix program. And the Phoenix program, if you don't know about it, I mean, that could be a whole show by itself, but the Phoenix program was a, very top secret program during Vietnam that had used was trying to infiltrate the Viet Cong by trying to get, through very questionable means, torture, intimidation, to get people that were with the Viet Cong to admit to what they were up to. And eventually Congress found out about it, and they ended it because they found it to be way beyond what they thought was ethical means of trying to combat the Viet Cong. So that just gives you a little bit of background. Like, there's players in this whole story that have connections to the CIA, who were part of former deep cover operations. So John DeCamp, who I'm sure we'll talk more about, he wrote the book. He ends up becoming the lawyer and representative of Paul Bonacci and other people who are accused or alleging that they were part of the sex ring. He has a background too that goes with connections to the CIA. Again, that could be a whole rabbit hole by itself, but it's interesting to just think about this. They're trying to create this board, this committee that can look into this issue that's on the up and up. And somehow or another, they're constantly running up against people who have these different sort of sorted backgrounds, have interconnections with each other, and it's becoming harder and harder to find someone that they could trust. So I think you bringing up Caradori and how you did it was perfect, because Gary Caradori was one of the few people they could find as a private investigator who had no dog in the fight, so to speak. He was kind of an objective outsider who they didn't have to worry about might be corrupted in some way due to ulterior motives. And Caradori takes over, like you mentioned, and one of his early leads is this guy, Michael Casey. And Michael Casey is the one who ultimately leads him to Paul Bonacci and Owen and other people that Caradori starts to investigate. And this Michael Casey character, he himself has a bit of a sordid background. He's a guy who's worn a bunch of different hats. But when Caradori meets up with him, he is saying that he's been an investigative journalist. He's been looking into this whole Larry King corruption case for years, and he has a lot of different people that he's already worked as witnesses. In fact, he claims that he has a video with Larry King in it of Larry King partaking in, pedophilic acts. Of course, that never really comes to fruition. He never is able to give Caradori the tape. But another thing he claims that does have factual evidence is that he does have a former Boys Town student who he's had interviews with during his investigation into the case, that he has on recorded tape, and he shares this with Caradori. And he also shares with Caradori that he has other witnesses, one of them being Alicia Owen, and the other one eventually being a kid by the name of, he was a kid at the time, or 17 years old, who is the name of Troy Bonner, and then Troy Bonner, who was also friends with Paul Bonacci. So really, it's this Michael Casey character who begins to kind of become a main conduit for a lot of these other witnesses that Caradori really uses as some of his hardest evidence and presents to the committee of what he's found. However, Casey's a questionable character because he was a former Boys Town employee who got fired for inappropriate conduct, nothing sexual, but he was doing some things that they found that were inappropriate, so he gets fired. He has a history of criminal activity, credit fraud, forgeries. He did a stint in jail at some time. So this guy, Michael Casey, who kind of reinvents himself as an investigative journalist years later and is claiming that he has all this inside info and contacts that have to do with Larry King, you have to take some of it with a grain of salt because people have questioned Casey's intentions. So that's how Caradori begins to get a lot of his, big witnesses. And he starts meeting with the Boys Town student who was recorded on tape, who begins to reference some of the big names in the Omaha area that he claims when he went to these sex parties were there. One of them being a well-known newscaster in the area of Omaha named Peter Citron.
Yes.
He said there and had done sexual acts with the boys. Peter Citron later actually is arrested a few years later for pedophilic conduct and goes to jail, but not directly related to the Larry King story. Another name that comes up that he says was at this party is a very well-to-do, wealthy, powerful individual in the Omaha area by the name of Alan Baer. He's kind of the heir of this powerful family. And he says he's also at these parties and doing things with him. And that begins to open up the can of worms and then eventually leads him to Alicia Owen, who, as you mentioned, all these kids are troubled kids. And it's the perfect target for these sorts of sex trafficking things, right? You're not going to get a kid, or if you're someone who's a predator, you certainly don't want to target kids from upstanding families. These are not the type of kids that are going to be easily manipulated. You want to find kids, if you're trying to do something like this, who have homes to go to, who have drug problems that you can use as ways to lure them into joining your issue, joining your whole ring. And that's the type of kids these are. These are troubled kids who were easily lured in because of different issues that they had. And Alicia Owen was no different. And she was actually in prison at the time that Caradori finds her, because he has to search around. She's not in Omaha at the time. She had left Omaha. She was out of Nebraska. She had traveled around the country a bit, and she was now in prison, I believe in Colorado. He goes out there to meet her because she was in prison for writing bad checks. And while he's in there, she begins to talk to Caradori about her experiences in the sex ring, which she had shared with Michael Casey before she left Nebraska. So Caradori's trying to follow up with Alicia. And in the meantime, Alicia starts telling him about another gentleman she met, another young 17-year-old that she met, who was one of the prostitutes, if you want to think about them that way, Troy Bonner, who she becomes friends with and ends up having a romantic relationship with. And this becomes another person of interest for Caradori. He reaches out to Troy Bonner and he begins interviewing him. And so he's starting to build this list of witnesses. And Troy Bonner starts to tell him about his issues. Troy Bonner is a self-confessed drug addict. He was a kid from a troubled background. He claims Larry King had kept him kind of under his thumb by offering him drugs, by offering him money. And as a result, he was being kind of flown all around the country, from anywhere from Washington, D.C. to out to California, where he was kind of being sold off as a prostitute for people who wanted underage prostitutes.
Yep.
Another name that will come up is Troy Bonner's quote unquote best friend, Danny King, another individual who Caradori interviews, who says was also an underage kid at the time and was being used by Larry King. He's in a relation to Larry King. He has the same last name, but he references him as someone who was part of the sex ring. So now you have Troy Bonner, Alicia Owen, Danny King, all claiming that they kind of corroborating stories, which is important. They're all kind of corroborating each other's stories and what was going on, where and when these things took place. And Caradori is trying to corroborate on his end that everything they're telling him actually took place. So there's all this kind of building of a case that Caradori's doing and a lot of background work. And it, one thing Caradori does that I think is interesting and pretty, he starts to interview some of the pilots that had flown some of these jets and trying to corroborate whether at the time that these kids are telling him that they were being trafficked around the country, were these pilots seeing kids? And a number of the pilots said they do remember flying Larry King around. They do remember young underage kids coming onto the planes. None of them reported seeing anything specifically going on, but definitely seeing it was very odd that these young kids were they were flying these young kids with these older politicians around the country. So they do corroborate on that end that there was these kids being flown around while Larry King was around and attending these different possible events. A lot of these trips were being taken to Washington, D.C., as the flight attendants point out. A lot of back and forth from Washington, D.C., some back and forth to California. But of course, when you hear Washington, D.C., you raise an eyebrow where, like, now you're seeing this trafficking is somewhat related possibly to politicians and people in the D.C. area related to government.
Yeah. So I like how you brought that up. It seems like Caradori, first off, you did a great job at getting into like who all these main witnesses, because there's like the list of people involved in this could just go on and on and on. The names of all these other kids involved, but the main group of witnesses: Alicia Owen, Danny King, Troy Bonner. They all met Larry King either through this loft that he had at Twin Towers Apartments. It was either through Boys Town, the Girls Club, a gay bar called the Max. All of these people were kind of roped in to Larry King, and then Paul Bonacci was one of them that even though it seems like he was getting pulled into another way just through sexual abuse, maybe around these same sorts of social circles, because he was involved in getting sexually abused when he was young, and somehow he gravitated to these social circles. But they were all kind of roped into this same sort of circle of people, and these heavy hitters, including Alan Baer, who was the heir of a department store family. Bob Wadman, somebody else, another name that came up, and this was why one of the main aspects of the press was staunchly fighting against any truth about the Franklin scandal getting out. It was a man named Harold Anderson was a name being tossed into the mix, and he was actually a former publisher of the Omaha World Herald. A paper, which was one of the biggest papers in the area of Omaha. So anytime they would write a story, because it's like everybody was getting pulled into this, and it was shining a spotlight on the dirty, dark corners of society that nobody really wanted to admit we're there. It's an uncomfortable truth about society. And the second people are like, well, my job's getting pulled into this, and people that I thought were good people are getting pulled into this, everybody's like stood up and said, no, we have to fight against these people coming forward, making these horrible claims against the people that we hold so dearly to our society. And in one case, Paul Bonacci, which was one of the victims, stated that he was flown around the country, like you were saying, for these political reasons, for 200 to 300 different flights, and it got, Gary Caradori actually was able to get, like you said, these pilots. One of the airlines was YNR Airlines, and he was actually able to find records supporting these claims, because ultimately, just for the sake of time, I'm going to jump forward that when these stories were heard at a grand jury in a court proceeding to try to find these people accountable for these horrible things that they did, and we're kind of trying to get into a little bit more of that with the time that we have left. Ultimately, the trial was considered, per the Omaha World Herald, just like I stated, who's one of their former publishers, was roped into being one of the perpetrators of pedophilia in some of these parties. It was, quote unquote, a carefully crafted hoax. So effectively, they didn't find Larry King. He wound up doing some time, but it had nothing to do with the worst claims that were going on about him. It was almost like they threw him a bone and they gave him a break by giving him just 10 to 15 years, and I don't even think he served all of it. I think he served like 10 years total for the money laundering, because they couldn't just allow him to skate now that this was in public view, that he stole, $40 million. And I think out of the complete 50 million that went missing or something to that level, I think only 7.5 or 8.5 was actually paid back to the people it was stolen from. So they, a lot of those people, this ruined people's lives, their entire retirement money, like everything. This was like, with what we heard about in more recent times with Bernie Madoff, these Ponzi schemes. Ponzi schemes, for those of you that don't know, are intended to fail. And it's not like by the people setting these Ponzi schemes up don't say, hey, I'm going to set this scheme up and I'm going to fail someday. Like, that's why I'm doing this. Like, why would you get involved in a situation you know is going to fail? For lack of a better word, they don't care if it fails. These are people that are beyond the scope of having the sense of morality that you and I would think about when starting a credit union or a business or any sort of above board, upstanding type of business. They are just stealing money from people. They are purporting their company to be something it's not, promising scores of investors that they're going to all make off like fat cats. And then with that false promise comes the money. And then these people basically just become these antisocial, what we once knew as psychopathic, sociopathic type of personalities. They just spend and spend and spend and spend for their own carnal needs to live the best lives of kings and the sickest and most corrupt Roman rulers. They live those lives, and they literally just don't care. And eventually what's going to happen is that money's getting spent and not enough money's coming in. One of the investors is eventually going to say, hey, I want my money back. I want the 12 million that you said you made me. And then they're going to start getting the runaround. Oh, well, I can give you 50,000. No, I want the 12 million now. And then they start realizing something's wrong. So eventually somebody's going to blow the whistle that something funny is going on with these organizations. And that's how they usually wind up crumbling down on themselves. So just to kind of circle back around then is, as far as what, just because these are some really big key points of what was going on here. Gary Caradori is uncovering truths. He is uncovering links. Mm-hmm. But when the verdict is out on this trial, it comes out to the world and per the World Herald. And there was a newspaper that stuck in there, and I forget, it was the Record. I have it here. The Nebraska Observer was a paper that actually fought for justice for some of these victims. Mm-hmm. It was one of the papers that wasn't corrupted, and they said that, like, how much of a sham job this whole trial was. But so even though they didn't hold accountable Larry King for any of these crimes. And I just want to kind of get into, maybe this was just to give people an idea of how bad of an actor Larry King was and some of the accusations that were going against him, because we skirted into some of the things he was doing and how he was, if it's not bad enough to hear that somebody's pimping out children, like, this is how bad of an actor, he was. In one case, and this is probably some of the worst. I mean, there was a lot of really disturbing claims here, but there's just too many to go over. I mean, with the time that we have, where we're going to stick to about an hour here, it's just so much, and you just can't go over all of it. But this is just one of the worst things I heard, and Larry King was directly involved in this. One of the victims, who was vindicated later because they said he was just a liar. They didn't even really put him on the stand, because they called Alicia Owen, who said that Larry King facilitated sexual trysts with Chief Wadman when she was 14. So he was basically pimping out Alicia Owen to the chief of the Omaha police, and that was where this connection came through. And then she claims she even fathered a daughter. Chief Wadman fathered a daughter, and they claim that the DNA test stated that came back, and it wasn't the case. But there was a lot of people that said that they saw Wadman hanging around these parties, and they saw Alicia Owen hanging around these parties. So it wouldn't shock me. And there was a restaurant they would meet at, this French restaurant. They would go into the basement, and this is where a lot of these dinners and a lot of these sexual excursions happened. But anyhow, circling back around to Paul Bonacci, he said over the 200 to 300 flights that he took across the country to have sex with different players in this country for the purpose of being pimped out by King. Under the threat of death, a lot of times. He was scared for his life this whole period of his life when he was a child, getting forced into prostitution. He was flown out to, in July of 1994, July of 1984, he was flown out to somewhere around Sacramento, California, and he was drove out to an area that he was only told it was the nickname or code name of Bohemian Grove. And he met up with another 12 or 13-year-old named Nicholas. And these two boys, effectively forced at gunpoint, were met with another naked young boy in a cage, and they were told to basically have sex with this boy, to rape this boy on camera. There was a film crew out there, and he said that they were forced to put these Tarzan type suits on, and they had these men standing around, and they were basically at gunpoint forcing them to have sex with this boy who was scared, naked in a cage. And eventually another man came in and started having sex with this boy who was raping him. It was an absolute horror show. This kid was bleeding, he was screaming. Eventually they threw these kids on the ground, and they lined them all up, and they put guns to their head, and they blew this one kid's head off effectively. And then they mutilated this kid's body, and they forced, Bonacci later stated on tape, and this is really graphic, Bonacci didn't even want to talk about it on tape. He said he was forced to bite his genitals off so these people could hold this boy's genitals after he was killed as a trophy. And then they forced them to watch the video later on that night. And King was present. He said King was present for this snuff film. And then later on in 2005, what was it? Who was this guy's name? Rusty Nelson. Rusty Nelson stated that on video, he stated that he was approached by King to shoot a snuff film. And this is one of the big bombs dropped. And I don't even know if we could, that's why this just becomes, it gets stranger and stranger. Bonacci and Rusty Nelson both claimed the producer of this snuff film that I just recently had talked about was Hunter Thompson, the Agonzo journalist. So I don't know if that was a code name or what. And then Bonacci claimed that a man that looked like Rusty Nelson was at this snuff film, and Rusty Nelson went on video saying they had someone that looked like him be there. But it just kind of paints a picture of the sort of bad actor that this guy Larry King was. Really, really bad actor. And then when the verdict comes out on this court trial that he was found guilty for none of pandering children, none of child, any sort of claims of, they call it pandering or prostitution for children. Nothing for abusing children, for touching children, for nothing. All the claims about King and all these young underage homosexual trysts that he was having, And it was even brought to light why one of the sergeants of the Omaha Police Department, I don't have his name right in front of me, he stated off the record when they looked further into it, child prostitution has been going on forever. Like, what do you want from us? You think King was doing anything different than hasn't been going on here? So, like, it was just this general, nobody really wanted to get to the bottom of this. And to kind of sum this up, that Gary Caradori was actually getting to the bottom of this. In July of 1991, Caradori was on his way back from a baseball game with his 8-year-old son, AJ, and a farmer claims they just saw the plane go up into flames in the air. A lot of people didn't like Gary Caradori, not because he wasn't a good person, because he was getting to the bottom of a lot of really uncomfortable facts with some people real high up in the world. And a lot of people believe he was murdered, and his 8-year-old son, AJ, was murdered in this plane crash. They never came to any sort of conclusive investigation about why this plane just went up into flames in the middle of the air. And as of right now, a lot of people close to these people believe that they were murdered because they were getting close to some truths about this investigation. And he was just one of a handful of people. So,
and to add one piece to that whole trip that Caradori takes with his son, the main reason he was going out on that trip was because he was supposedly meeting with Rusty Nelson, I believe, and Nelson was going to be providing him with photos that he had taken or he had access to of King and other high-end people that were involved in these parties with these children. And the whole reason that he went out for that trip was because he went to pick up those photos. And while he was out picking up those photos from Nelson, him and his son went to a baseball game, and he kind of turned it into like this father-son weekend as well as like a quick little business stop. But here he has perhaps the most damning evidence in the case as of yet, right? If you want to, at that point, if the defense was arguing that, well, all these kids are recanting some of their information, they're not trustworthy, it's all hearsay. Here you had for the first time hard possible evidence of images that would have been a nail in the coffin, so to speak. And here he is on his way back with that evidence, and his plane goes up in flames. So it's important to think about like what at that particular moment, why people who want Caradori, if you were someone who had something to lose and you were a powerful person that was involved in the sex parties and all of that, more than ever at that particular moment, you needed Caradori gone. So, that's, and there's some debate that the farm, I guess the plane crashed onto like a farm. The farm, the FBI apparently showed up. Like the farmer that owned the property said that the FBI, before he could even go onto the property, he said that there were like papers in the air kind of fluttering through the property. And before he could even really see the whole thing, by the time he called the police had already contacted the FBI. The entire place was searched. And he said by the time they left, there wasn't a trace of anything left. So whether, again, that's not on record, but that's supposedly what some investigative journalists who have spoken to that farmer that owned the property where the plane hit reported. So, I mean, if it doesn't get any more, certainly suspicious, and there's a whole trail of things like Caradori is the most glaring, but there is a whole trail, and we could maybe go into this at another time, maybe do a follow-up just to kind of wrap this up. But I think it'll be worth the time to even hit home how many people that were involved in uncovering the story, terrible things happened in their life, whether if they were killed, their reputations were purposely destroyed. It's just one person after another. It's unbelievable. It's like something you would think you would read in like some John le Carre, like spy novel or some sort of made for TV movie. It just doesn't seem real, but it is all real. There's a whole list of people who nothing but suicides, apparent suicide, supposed suicides, character assassinations, one person after another who was coming out and trying to uncover the story ended up in the end. So it's one of those amazing stories and never more appropriate. I think the timing here that we chose to kind of put this story out is perfect with the whole. I mean, we just had the P. Diddy situation that's going on with his sex trafficking. I don't know if you heard about the CEO of Abercrombie and Fitch, and they're finding out that he was involved, and he's being, he was just recently, I think last week, arrested or being called in for sex trafficking many of the male models that he had working for
Wow.
Abercrombie and Fitch back in the 90s. So this
Yep.
story is maybe some consider the first big story that hit the national scene about sex trafficking in America. And at its highest levels, this story is like the start of it. It really begins to put this in motion before we
Yeah.
ever hear of Jerry Epstein or any of these other
Yes.
stories that we now hear.
And conveniently, in the Epstein case, what was one of the biggest thoughts and memes on the internet in the past a couple of years is like Jerry. What was it? What's his first name? Epstein.
Yeah, Jeffrey Epstein.
Oh, Jeffrey Epstein did not kill himself, and I even went into the story with one of my other friends, who's the host of a Murder Coaster podcast. I did a little blurb on their 50th anniversary. I talked about a story where a police officer that used to work at one of the departments I used to work at down in the southern part of Westchester, and he was a police officer somewhere else, was his cellmate, and how he put his hands around Epstein's how he put his hands around Epstein's neck. He wanted to test something out, and he like choked him, and Epstein said something to the staff, and he had to be moved into his own cell about a week before he wound up, quote unquote, hanging himself, and all just the strange things that happened around that death, and like with again, similar types of circumstances. Even though Gary Caradori wasn't the perpetrator, he was like a man that knew too much, or a man that was starting to know too much, or had too much information. Very much, if we look through history, and I'm not trying to get too conspiracy theory, I'm trying to get to the truth here. We see in history Jeffrey Epstein knew too much. We see that Lee Harvey Oswald knew too much. Like, there are people that knew too much, and obviously, we know by histories these people were taken out. So to kind of just sum this up, yeah, there was I was going to get more into it, but there was quite a bit more that came out about a lot of illegal activity in Omaha and the link to King and potential gang members, and squashing a all-black task squad that was going to cut down on drug activity. Wadman knew about it. The suspicious deaths, the list, a short list of that: Kathleen Sorensen, Dan Ryan, Aaron Owen, the little brother of Alicia Owen, where we already talked about Gary and AJ Caradori, Sean Bonner, or Bonner, which was Troy Bonner's younger brother, died of Russian roulette. Bill Baker was found shot in the head. He operated pornographic operations with Larry King. So there was a long list, and we even had a comment made by she became the foster mother, Kathleen Sorensen, of Nellie and Kimberly Webb. In 1985, these couple that were eventually let go of the Webb household of Barbara and Jarrett Webb, and they were brought to talk about some of their stories. The more she looked into it, she found out deeply. She was the foster mother of the Webbs after. She looked into Satanism in the Midwest, and she was driving home after she was getting threats, and somebody had a head-on collision with her. And the couple that actually wound up doing the head-on collision, they did a background history on them. They were found to be accused of animal cruelty at one point in their lives, which is a red flag for Satanism, people who torture animals. And then a comment was made at a hospital to a girl who was involved in this also, says, "Hey, we're going to get you like we got that woman from Blair." She made a comment about how this lady was targeted for speaking out against all this stuff. So this is dangerous stuff. And like I said, very, very disturbing. And we just hope that at some level, by us shedding some light into the dark, a lot of times you become these type of people that sheds light into the dark, and you become the nail that stands out of the wood. And, they say the nail that stands out of the wood gets hammered the hardest. And there is some truth to that. And I'm just going to point out the example of Gary Caradori and his, tireless effort to get to the bottom of this corruption and evil, and how he paid dearly for it. And, according to many people around him, that he was murdered along with his son. So, we try our best. I think the average person just feels like these sorts of situations, they hear about them, and they're just so nebulous. They're just so complicated that the average person doesn't know where to start. And if you don't know where to start, you kind of just throw your hands up and say, hey, well, there's nothing I can do about that anyway, so just allow it to continue. I think that is why these things happen, because a lot of people do feel powerless. But I think the more that we shine light into the darkness, even if at some level it may make us targets ourselves just because there are bad actors in this world and there is evil in this world. I remember it was one of our police academy class quotes. "We hunt the evil that you pretend doesn't exist" was our class quote when I graduated the police academy. And that was like, there is, the older I get and the more I see about this world, there is some truth to that. There's a lot of people that just want to bury their heads in the sand and pretend this sort of thing doesn't exist. It's just too uncomfortable, and it pops the little bubble on the perfect lives that they have, or the lives that they try to keep as perfect as they can. So, I certainly appreciate you coming on, Jess, and I
Yeah,
appreciate
my
you
pleasure.
talking about this. Hopefully everybody got nothing, no wheel reinvented here. We're just going over, try to do it in a very systematic fashion as much as we could in the time that we had, which is just not enough to really get into this. So if you guys want to check out any of the books by the book by John DeCamp, the book by Nick Bryant, the documentary, what was it, Conspiracy of Silence. So there is a number of points of reference, the main points that the main bulk of the material that we went over, that anybody out there listening can go over for themselves and make their own judgments on a lot of these claims, if there was truth to this matter, or if it was like the Omaha Records World Herald said, a carefully crafted hoax. But we believe, obviously, by the way we're talking, that there was some truth to this, and this was a really bad situation. Hopefully we can keep putting the light on these bad actors in this world, and we can get some justice for the people that are being treated unfairly. And if you have anything else to add, Jess, or was there anything else you had to say?
No, well said. I totally agree with everything. And the challenge, like you state, I just would say with all of this is, especially as you hear it more often and again, the real battle, I think, for average people is, don't allow yourself to fall prey to cynicism and apathy, because that's what I think the bad actors that we're talking about hope will happen.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, don't let them basically, catch you, not feeling like you're bogged down so much with these, with the things that I spoke about, to not feel like that you don't care anymore, because it's easy to adopt that mentality. And I think the more somebody's getting away with something and the more the light is not getting shine on what they're doing, it's easy to kind of develop that sort of apathy that you're speaking about. So again, I appreciate you coming on Not Media. For everybody listening, please like and subscribe and comment. I will get back to you. We will comment back if there's anything that you'd like to talk about, any suggestions in the future. We certainly appreciate everybody coming on. And thanks again, Jesse, for coming on to Not Media. Everybody stay well. Thank you all for listening to this episode, and thank you everyone who has chosen a life of service. This is not just military, fire, police, and EMS, but also anyone who has taken their talents and passions and used them for the service and betterment of others and this world. I'm not saying goodbye, I'm saying until next time. This is your host at Not Media, JP, signing off. Stay well, everyone.